Alpha Eagle 49, Charlie 22 to Overwatch.
This is Overwatch. Continue, Alpha Eagle.
Overwatch, we're approaching the target a little hotter than we thought. The headwind never showed up, and we've been cruising a little fast. Requesting instructions on how to proceed, over.
This is Overwatch. Hold tight, Alpha Eagle. Keep this channel open, over.
Copy, Overwatch.
Peter checked the instruments reflexively, like a man looking out the side mirror of his car on the highway. The sky unfurled in front of them and went on forever like the sea. Wisps of clouds painted the air around the stadium-sized bombers. They glided under the sun without so much as a bump. Despite his status as a Navy-trained aeronautical engineer, it always amazed him that a hunk of steel weighing thousands of tons could fly like this.
This is Overwatch, Alpha Eagle.
Alpha Eagle.
Pull it back to 8,000 feet at 250 knots and maintain your course. Overwatch, out.
Alpha Eagle, copy, out.
Peter clicked the radio back into the control and made the necessary adjustments to slow the machine down. He stayed on course and admired the sky. He addressed his co-pilot, Kyle, whose arms were crossed tight and his chin bounced off his chest at irregular intervals, suggesting he was falling asleep. I'm stepping away to do a status check. You good? His co-pilot shook back to life. Oh, you got it, Ace, Kyle said with a grin. His big white teeth flashed under his suntanned face. Peter's head filled with furious radio static as he breathed deep and swallowed the flash of anger. He hated it when he called him Ace. He hated Kyle. He thought his co-pilot was unprofessional and idiotic. Kyle's one of those dildos who would brag at bars to half-listening women that he, quote, took the big birds to the skies. Dingus. Peter put his arm on Kyle's shoulder and pressed down, too hard, on purpose. Thanks. Peter stretched and exited the cabin. He walked past the flight crew as they mechanically stared at monitors and hit switches under the dimmed blue light of the flight deck. There were stories that the female crew would jerk off the men next to them under the heavy desks as they flew. Peter was both disgusted and envious of the men who received such hospitality. Captain, a sergeant addressed him formally and saluted. Yeah, Peter huffed and waved her off. He exited the flight deck and continued through the plane. There was a slight bump and he didn't even notice it as he continued towards the bomb bay. His heart skipped a beat and he suppressed a smile. This was his favorite part of the plane. This was his favorite part of the job. He wanted to check the payload and wisecrack with the bombardiers before heading back to the controls. He wanted to say one final adios to the bombs. Men and women walked past him with purpose, carrying documents and rushing to where they needed to be in time for the bombing. He brushed past them as he approached the ladder that led to the belly of the plane and slid down the tube like a fireman. He grabbed one of the helmets that lined the wall and opened the door to the deck. A rush of air pushed him back, but he kept his footing. The mouth of the bomb bay gaped, and the blue sky was a brilliant, endless void. The second lieutenant leaned with his back against the wall in his flight suit, a yellow safety vest with reflectors tied tight. He watched his men fasten the weapons to the bombing slides. Minivans on the bomb deck went to the back of the plane in 8 rows, each 100 yards long. The windows steamed with the terrified breath of the passengers. The condemned families inside pounded on the glass, but Peter could barely hear the thuds under the near-deafening noise of the airship.
Lieutenant,
Peter said with a grin. Oh, hey, Captain, Carlos happily replied. He put his hand out and Peter clasped it. He leaned in for a one-armed hug and clapped his comrade on the back. He pulled away and Carlos was still smiling. He was a rough, 5-foot-tall black man with kind eyes and dark freckles on his cheekbones.
We ready to go? Yep, just checking her out. May I? Be my guest,
Carlos chirped, and bowed with his arm in a swooping motion like a tickled maitre d'. Peter walked through the rows of minivans, clapping every other one on the side and kicking tires here and there. Families slammed themselves against the windows in implacable panic. Peter barely noticed, nor was he moved. In 15 minutes' time, they'd be hurtling towards Earth, ass over elbows, accelerating to the ground at 66 feet per second. There were 42 vans total, each with a payload of 3, 4, or 5 people, and some had as many as 6, and the thought of having 4 children made Peter shudder. He inspected a champagne Ford Windstar from head to toe. On the back of the minivan was a bumper sticker with stick figures representative of each of the family members. A dad, a mom, 2 boys, a dog, and a fish. A fish? Thought Peter. This was new to him. He smiled and tapped it with his finger. 2 boys cried in the back seat as the mother climbed to the back of the van, violently slamming her fist against the window, crying and pleading with Peter. He couldn't understand a word she said. Her face was purple, it was so red, and tears streamed down her eyes under crazy hair. Peter tapped on the window, not so much as to taunt her, but to just let her know that he saw her. As he circled the car, she followed him, smacking the window with an open palm. The car had a big dent that ran along the side door that came to an abrupt halt before the passenger door, where it had been scratched and discolored. It had traded paint with a safety post in some parking lot 5,000 feet below. But they were probably headed to the same parking lot at 8,000 feet per 250 knots. Peter frowned at her careless driving. He hoped the kids hadn't been inside when it happened. But he caught himself thinking this, and he chuckled. He took a deep breath. In the driver's seat was the father. He had a trimmed mustache, and he was pretty young. He stared forward as if he'd already died, and his wife's hysteria didn't seem to affect him. Good man, Peter thought. He patted his hand on the hood of the van like a car wash attendant alerting the driver that his tires were dry and it was good to go. The man stared through him. His glossy blue eyes watered. He wore a plaid dress shirt, buttoned all the way to the top. His wife had climbed to the front of the van, reclined in the passenger seat, and began kicking and pushing at the windshield, laying down on her back. Never once had Peter seen anyone break through. He wondered what would happen if his own car fell into a lake and he couldn't escape no matter how hard he pushed against the reinforced glass. He frowned at the thought. Peter shuffled back to Carlos, weaving between the minivans. Some passengers were more crazed than others. A few families arranged themselves in a circle the best they could and held hands inside the vans, probably praying. Peter grunted a fascinated, huh, whenever he'd see this. He admired their ability to keep the faith, knowing full well they'd be crashing down on their town, erupting in a fireball that would split their house or church or school or strip mall or doctor's offices or chain restaurants like a kamikaze hitting a destroyer. So many bumper stickers, Peter curiously thought to himself. What a strange way to project an identity to strangers in traffic. The stick figure families seemed to be in vogue this month. Several minivans supported different political candidates. If these people were serious enough to slap on a sticker for their guy, there was no doubt they had argued with neighbors about politics. It was kind of hilarious, Peter thought, considering they all meet the same fate and none of their beliefs really mattered in the first place. Interesting. Peter exited the rows of minivans as the passengers pounded and prayed and screamed and cried behind him. Carlos got to business, directing his team to start the release procedures. In 10 minutes' time, each minivan would have its turn, sliding on well-greased platforms that deposited them into the sky, headed down to their own communities, each set for a target with unforgiving mathematical precision. The fleet of bombers had a minivan for each and every family in the city, and soon those families would be for the ages. Peter tried to enjoy every moment of the trip, but he was more excited to get back on the ground and watch the aftermath on his phone at the officer's bar. Carlos directed Peter with his head, giving him a "time to get going" look. Peter nodded and clapped Carlos on the shoulder as he exited the bomb bay. He hung his helmet on the wall and put his hand on the cold steel of the ladder. 5,000 feet below, a small, vacant town with identical houses and churches and strip malls waited for them, and in no time they'd be devastated. Steel would melt through houses, and body parts and tires and broken glass and pieces of dead cats and dogs would float in what remained of backyard pools. He took a deep breath and smiled as he climbed up. He was born to do this.